The night Ethan Cross's wife and daughter died, something inside him crystallized into stone. Not gradually, not over time, but in that single moment, the moment when the hospital chaplain said the words that shattered his world, Ethan felt something fundamental break away from his body and disappear into the darkness. It was his capacity to feel joy. It was his ability to connect with another human being. It was essentially his humanity. Please, if you enjoy watching my videos, subscribe, like and comment where you are watching from so we could grow together. Thank yous. That was 12 years ago. 12 years of breathing without really living. 12 years of building an empire while slowly dying inside. 12 years of waking up each morning and wondering why he bothered, then waking up the next morning and doing it all over again. Ethan's net worth had grown to $847 billion. His company controlled 60% of the global tech market. His name was synonymous with power and success and the kind of untouchable wealth that made ordinary people's heads spin. But Ethan couldn't remember the last time he genuinely smiled. His mouth had forgotten its shape. His penthouse office occupied the entire 54th floor of a building in Manhattan. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the city that should have been beautiful but instead looked like a graveyard of glass and steel and human desperation. Ethan stood at those windows each morning and each evening, watching the masses move through their lives like cells in an organism, each one believing their small dramas mattered, each one hoping for something better. He'd stopped hoping years ago. Hope was dangerous. Hope made you vulnerable. Hope was what had killed his wife and daughter. They'd hoped the brakes on his car would work properly that rainy night. They'd hoped the other driver would be paying attention. They'd hoped that physics and chance would align in their favor. Hope had been proven to be nothing but a lie. His assistant knocked at the door at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday. Ethan was still working, though there was nothing left to work on. All his projects were managed. All his acquisitions were complete. All his goals had been achieved. The knocking was unusual. No one interrupted Ethan. The entire company understood that interruption was punishable by termination. "Sir," his assistant said, trembling slightly in the doorway, "you have a call. It's important." Ethan didn't look up from the spreadsheet that meant nothing. "End the call." "Sir, he says it's urgent. He says he has a proposal that could change everything." Ethan finally turned. His assistant was a young man named Marcus, probably 25, probably harboring dreams of becoming something more than a personal assistant. Ethan had hired him specifically because he was talented enough to be a threat, and Ethan liked keeping talented, dangerous people close where he could monitor them. It kept him sharp. "I don't care," Ethan said. "I don't want to change anything. I want to be left alone." But something in his voice must have betrayed him because Marcus took a step forward anyway. "He said you'd say that. He said to tell you that if you're truly unreachable, then this should be easy. He said $5 billion and immortal fame." Ethan felt something stir in his chest. Not interest exactly. More like the memory of what interest might feel like. $5 billion was nothing to him. But the game was intriguing. The challenge was intriguing. The possibility that someone might actually believe they could crack his facade was almost amusing. "Put him through," Ethan said. The man on the phone was a venture capitalist named David Chin, and he got straight to the point. He'd been studying Ethan for years, he said. He'd noticed the pattern. How Ethan had systematically eliminated joy from his life. How he'd built walls so high that nothing could penetrate them. How he'd essentially transformed himself into an emotional void wearing an Armani suit. "What if we made it public?" Chin asked. "What if you announced that anyone who could make you laugh, genuinely laugh, would receive $5 billion? Not as charity. Not as some kind of stunt. But as a real, achievable goal." Ethan listened to the silence on the line. Somewhere in that silence he could hear the faint sound of traffic. Somewhere in that silence, people were living their lives and dying their deaths and believing that none of it mattered. "Why would I do that?" Ethan asked. "Because," Chin said, "you're bored. You've conquered everything there is to conquer. And deep down, underneath all that ice, you want to feel something again. You want to know if it's still possible." Ethan hung up the phone. But he didn't delete the number. Instead, he stared at it for the rest of the night, watching it glow on his screen like a challenge written in light. By morning, he'd made his decision. The announcement went live at 6 a.m., and the internet exploded like a supernova. Within minutes, the story had been picked up by every major news outlet. Within hours, it had become the #1 trending topic globally. Within days, the world had transformed into a kind of circus, and Ethan's penthouse had become the center ring. Billionaire offers $5 billion to anyone who can make him laugh. The applications came from everywhere. From unemployed comedians in dingy apartments. From Oscar-winning actors who thought they'd found their next big challenge. From TikTok stars and YouTube sensations and people who'd built entire careers on making people cry with laughter. From doctors and nurses and teachers who believed that humor could heal anything. From desperate people who saw $5 billion as the answer to every prayer they'd ever whispered. Ethan's team selected the applicants carefully. They wanted the very best. They wanted people who'd made millions laugh, who'd won awards, who'd dedicated their entire lives to the craft of comedy. The auditions began on a Monday morning in Ethan's private screening room. The first performer was a legendary comedian who'd been making people laugh for 40 years. His routine was perfect. Tight, polished, hilarious. He had the entire audience in stitches. Ethan sat in the back row, his face a mask of stone, and when the comedian finished, he stood up without a word and left the room. By the end of the first week, 73 people had tried and failed. The energy in the audition room had shifted from excitement to desperation. By week 2, entertainers were arriving with tears in their eyes, begging for one more chance, one more opportunity to crack the code that would make them $5 billion richer. Ethan watched them all fail and felt nothing. Which was exactly the point. He'd become good at feeling nothing. It was the one thing he'd truly mastered. The media coverage was relentless. Psychologists went on television to debate whether Ethan's inability to laugh indicated depression or sociopathy or a complete disconnection from humanity. Therapists offered their theories. Social media exploded with people claiming they had the secret to making him smile. Some people called it beautiful. Others called it cruel. Everyone agreed it was fascinating. Then came week 5 and Ethan's car broke down. His driver James had been with him for 9 years. James was careful and attentive and never asked questions, which was exactly why Ethan trusted him. That evening, they were driving back from the office to Ethan's penthouse when the car suddenly sputtered and died on a street in the Lower East Side. Not a nice neighborhood. Not a dangerous one exactly, but poor. The kind of place where Ethan's usual circle never ventured. "I'll call for a replacement," James said, but his phone had died and the car system wasn't responding. They'd have to wait for a tow truck and the nearest one was 40 minutes away. Ethan stepped out of the car to escape the confined space. The street smelled like garbage and wet concrete. Night was falling and the rain was coming down harder now, turning the sidewalk into a slick mirror of reflected neon and broken dreams. He stood under the awning of a closed shop, watching the city move around him with its usual indifference. That's when he noticed her. She was maybe 15, maybe 16. Her clothes were layered in a way that suggested she was wearing everything she owned. Her hair was the color of rust. But what caught Ethan's attention was her movement. While everyone else on the street moved with purpose or resignation, she was dancing. Actually dancing. In the rain. In the middle of a neighborhood where dancing seemed like rebellion against the universe. She spun in slow circles, arms spread wide, face turned up to the sky like she was receiving communion. Her lips were moving, talking to herself or maybe to the rain, and there was something luminous about her joy in that moment of total, absolute poverty. Ethan found himself stepping forward, out from under the awning into the rain. He'd forgotten what rain felt like. The girl stopped mid-spin when she noticed him. Water dripped from her eyelashes. Her eyes shifted color in the neon light. Gray one moment, green the next, like water over stone. "Your car's broken," she said. Not a question. A statement. "Observant," Ethan replied. "I'm Lila." She tilted her head, studying him with the kind of unfiltered honesty that most people had learned to hide. "You're sad. Can tell. You look like someone who forgot how to be happy." No one had ever said something like that to him before. Everyone around Ethan spoke carefully, like they were defusing a bomb. This girl just said what she saw, raw and unfiltered. "I'm not sad," Ethan said, which was a lie. He wasn't sad. He was something much worse than sad. He was hollowed out. He was a shell pretending to be human. "Yeah, you are," Lila said with absolute certainty. She reached into one of her pockets and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. "I'm trying to make people laugh. I could tell you something funny." Ethan felt something shift in his chest. "I'll pay you." Lila's expression changed. Not much, just a slight dimming of that extraordinary light. "How much?" $8,000, Ethan said, and he was already calculating the look on her face. Already predicting how she'd react to that kind of money. Already wondering if money was the answer to everything or if it was, in fact, the answer to nothing at all. Lila looked at him for a long time. The rain continued falling, transforming the street into an aquarium of light and shadow. "No," she said finally. "No." Ethan repeated. "I don't tell jokes to sad people who don't even want to smile," Lila said. She turned and started walking away. "It doesn't work that way." Ethan found himself following her. Not because he'd decided to. His body had simply made the choice without consulting his mind. She led him down the street to a small shelter built into the side of a building. Just an overhang, but enough for two people to stand under without getting soaked. "What's your name?" Lila asked. "Ethan." "Ethan what? Does it matter?" Lila smiled, and it was like turning on a light in a dark room. "No, I guess it doesn't. I'm just Lila. No last name. I don't think I ever had one that mattered." She sat down on the wet pavement, and after a moment Ethan sat down too. For the first time in 12 years he was sitting on the ground, getting rained on, talking to a homeless girl like she was the most important person in the world. "What do you do?" Lila asked him. "When the world is broken?" "I don't know," Ethan admitted. "I've forgotten how to do anything except survive." Lila pointed to a puddle of water that had collected in a depression in the street. "I pretend that's an ocean. And I'm standing on the shore, and somewhere out there is a ship with my name on it. And when I'm ready, I'm going to board that ship and sail to a place where sad people become happy again." Ethan looked at the puddle. It was just a puddle. But Lila had transformed it into something else. Something that held possibility. "That's a nice story," Ethan said. "It's not a story," Lila corrected gently. "It's the truth. Just a different kind of truth than the one you're used to." They talked through the evening as the rain slowly stopped. Lila told him about her life, how her parents had died when she was young, how she'd learned to survive on the streets by making friends with the stars and the wind and the empty spaces where no one else bothered to look. She didn't tell him these things because she wanted his pity. She told him because he asked, and she seemed to understand that sometimes people need to tell their stories to someone who actually listens. She told him about the old woman who let her sleep in a doorway 3 nights a week. The restaurant owner who saved leftover food for her. The librarian who let her use the bathroom and sometimes gave her books. She told him about her system for surviving, how she'd learned to be invisible to the people who wanted to hurt her and visible to the people who wanted to help. She told him about nights when she was terrified and alone, and how she'd learned to laugh anyway because, as she said, "If I stop laughing, I'll disappear." Something was happening inside Ethan's chest. A crack in the ice. It wasn't happiness, he was too broken for that, but it was something. It was the memory of what connection felt like. When his driver finally arrived with a replacement car, Ethan didn't want to leave. For the first time in 12 years, he didn't want to retreat back into his tower of glass and steel. "Come with me," he said. "Stay somewhere warm tonight." "No," Lila said, but her voice was kind. "Not yet. I'm not ready to stop being myself yet." But she took his phone number. And the next morning she called. Over the following weeks, Ethan found himself doing something unprecedented. He was waiting. Waiting for Lila's calls. Waiting for the moments when she'd agree to meet him. In a park, a diner, a quiet street corner. He was checking his phone constantly, something he'd stopped doing years ago. She refused his money with surprising consistency. When he tried to buy her food, she'd share it with other homeless people. When he tried to set up an account, she wouldn't access it. When he tried to arrange housing, she laughed and said, "You don't understand yet. I'm not homeless because I'm broken. I'm homeless because the world is broken and I'm not willing to pretend otherwise." But slowly she began to let him into her world. She showed him the abandoned building where she sometimes slept. The library where she spent her days reading philosophy and neuroscience and poetry. The rooftop where she went when she needed to feel close to her dead parents. The community of homeless people who had become her family. And Ethan, for all his wealth and power, was learning that he possessed nothing that mattered. One morning, Ethan received official notification. His $5 billion challenge had ended. None of the world's funniest people had succeeded. The media had moved on to other stories. The search was over. He was unreachable. He didn't care. He'd stopped thinking about the challenge weeks ago. He'd stopped thinking about laughing as a goal. He'd started thinking about Lila as a necessity. But something was changing in her. The brightness that had stopped him that rainy night was beginning to dim. Her stories were becoming darker. She mentioned her cough more often, brushed it off when Ethan asked if she was okay. She was spending more nights in cold places. The world was pressing down on her, testing the limits of her light. Then came the afternoon that changed everything. Ethan had finally convinced Lila to visit his penthouse apartment. Not to stay, not yet, but just to see. Just to know that there was a place for her if she ever decided she wanted it. They were sitting on the balcony overlooking the city, rain starting to fall again when Lila suddenly stood up. "Watch this," she said, and her voice had that familiar spark. That dangerous, alive quality that made her seem lit from within. She began to mock him. Her movements became exaggerated and stiff. Her voice dropped into a cold monotone. Her face became a perfect mask of emptiness. She moved through the apartment like a robot, speaking in his cold, measured tones about profit margins and quarterly reports and the importance of maintaining emotional distance. It was brutal. It was honest. It was the most clearly anyone had ever seen Ethan reflected back at him. She stopped in front of him. Her expression became serious. Their eyes met. "You're not scary," she said quietly. "You're just broken." There was a pause. A moment where the city held its breath. A moment where all the accumulated grief and pain of 12 years suddenly found a pressure point and began to release. Ethan started to laugh. Not a polite chuckle. Not a carefully modulated response. But a laugh that came from somewhere deep in his chest, from a place he'd thought was permanently sealed. It started as a sound and became a shaking in his shoulders, became tears streaming down his face, became a purification he'd never thought possible. He laughed and couldn't stop laughing. He laughed while Lila watched him with those shifting gray-green eyes. He laughed like he was breaking, like he was being healed, like he was experiencing both simultaneously. When he finally stopped, Lila was sitting next to him. She took his hand. It was the first time she'd initiated physical contact, and the warmth felt like electricity against his skin. "Thank you," Ethan said, and he meant it more than he'd ever meant anything. "I know," Lila said simply. The moment was captured by a security camera in the hallway. Somehow, and Ethan would never know exactly how, the footage leaked. Within hours it was viral across every platform. The world watched as the unreachable billionaire laughed like a human being, and the internet exploded. Homeless girl succeeds where world's funniest fail. The $5 billion moment that changed everything. How one girl brought the Iceman to life. News outlets couldn't decide what the story was about anymore. Love story? Redemption arc? Fairy tale? Miracle? The footage was played millions of times. People cried watching it. People felt hope. The homeless girl and the billionaire had become symbols of something larger than themselves. Ethan knew what had to happen next. The world was waiting for it. The $5 billion had been promised. The moment everyone had been waiting for had arrived. He met with his lawyers. He arranged the transfer. And then he called Lila to his office, to the screening room where he'd sat stone-faced through 100 performances. "You won," he said. "You earned it. The $5 billion is yours." He held out the check. $5 billion. Enough to change her entire life. Enough to change the lives of everyone she'd ever met. Lila looked at the check for a long moment. Then she looked at Ethan. "I don't want it," she said. "You have to," Ethan said. "It was the promise." "I didn't do it for the money," Lila said quietly. "I did it because you looked like you needed it. Because when I looked at you that night in the rain, I saw someone who had forgotten how to live. I saw someone disappearing. And I couldn't let that happen." Ethan felt something shift in his chest. Something deeper. More dangerous. "So what do you want?" he asked. Lila looked out the window at the city spreading beneath them. Millions of people living millions of small dramas. Millions of small victories and tragedies. "I want to help people like me," she said. "The ones sleeping on the streets. The ones the world forgot about. The ones who've learned to laugh while everything falls apart. I want to help them remember that they matter." Ethan nodded. He'd known that was what she would say. "Then here's what we're going to do," he said. He didn't give her the $5 billion in cash. Instead, he created something larger. A foundation in her name. Job training programs. Shelter facilities. Mental health support. But more importantly, he made an announcement that shocked his board of directors and the entire business world. He was stepping back from active leadership. He was shifting his focus. He was adopting Lila. Not as charity, not as public relations, but as family. As daughter. In the quiet aftermath, when the news cycle had moved on and the internet had found other obsessions, Ethan found Lila sitting in the garden of his penthouse, watching the sunset paint the sky in gold and crimson. He sat next to her without speaking. The silence between them had become a language. "Tell me a story," Ethan said finally. Lila smiled. That same smile that had stopped him in his tracks on that rainy night. "Once there was a sad man who lived in a tower so high he could see the entire world but couldn't touch any of it," she began. "He thought he was untouchable. He thought nothing could change him or make him feel alive. He had everything except the one thing that mattered: connection." She turned to look at him, and her eyes held all the colors of ocean and sky. Then he met a girl who had nothing but laughter and hope and wisdom. And that girl showed him that the most valuable thing in the world isn't something you can buy. It's being seen. It's being known. It's being loved exactly as you are. And what happened to them? Ethan asked. They saved each other, Lila said. But the story doesn't end there. That's when the real work began. She squeezed his hand and Ethan looked out at the city as darkness fell. Somewhere out there people were sleeping on the streets. Somewhere out there people were drowning in hopelessness. Somewhere out there were other broken people just like Ethan had been, people who didn't know yet that healing was possible. The foundation would help some of them. But could it help them all? And if not, what happened to the ones who fell through the cracks? What about the homeless teenagers still out there right now, at this exact moment, facing dangers that no amount of money could protect them from? Lila must have sensed his thoughts because she squeezed his hand tighter. You can't save everyone, she said softly. But you can try. And that's enough. Is it? Ethan asked, and the question hung in the air between them, unanswered, unresolved, leading only deeper into uncertainty. Night deepened around them. City lights began to shine brighter. And somewhere in that vast network of human connection and despair, countless small stories were unfolding. Stories about broken people searching for wholeness, lost people searching for home, people like the two sitting in this garden, trying to figure out how to save a world that seemed determined to destroy itself. Ethan didn't laugh again that night. But he felt the absence of laughter less sharply. What he felt instead was something deeper and more complex. He felt alive. He felt connected. He felt the terrible, beautiful weight of responsibility that came with being able to help others while knowing his power was limited. He felt the possibility of so much still to come. As night consumed the city and Lila's voice continued weaving stories into the darkness, Ethan understood something that all his money had never been able to teach him. The real story wasn't his redemption. The real story was just beginning. Because across the city, in shelters and on streets and in the dark corners of abandoned buildings, there were other Lilas. Other people with light in their eyes despite having nothing. Other people who laughed to keep themselves from disappearing. Other people who needed Ethan's help not as charity, but as a lifeline. And Ethan suddenly understood that the challenge wasn't over. The real challenge was just beginning. He looked at Lila, sitting beside him in the darkness, and asked the question that would define the rest of his life. How many do you think we can save? Lila didn't answer immediately. She turned her face back toward the city, toward all those people living in darkness below them. I don't know, she said finally. But I think the real question isn't how many we can save. It's how many we're willing to try for. And in that moment, with the question hanging unanswered between them, with the knowledge that the work ahead would be harder than anything Ethan had ever done, with the understanding that success wasn't guaranteed and that failure was always possible, in that moment Ethan realized something crucial. He had no idea what came next. The story didn't have an ending. It only had a beginning and a choice. And that choice, that terrifying, beautiful choice, was where everything would change. And